So your father was the first white leader of SCLC, worked with Martin Luther King, but that became
He's the only white guy on the executive committee.
The only white guy. But that created some tensions in your family, and some years later you felt the need to go back and recreate relationships with your family, didn't you?
Well, I wouldn't put it exactly, yeah, absolutely. But the sequence was somewhat different. So Dad became involved. He was a manager of the Atlanta Red Cross and many friends and colleagues who were business leaders. But he got involved in the late 50s in school desegregation. Didn't believe that schools should close. You know, a lot of the political establishment was calling for the schools to close rather than desegregate in the wake of the famous Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. So Dad got involved in school desegregation, believed in racial equality, one of the few whites in Atlanta who was outspoken about that, and then went on staff of SCLC in '63 and worked with SCLC for 3 years. And before he was with SCLC, my extended family in the South disowned us. They broke all relations.
Because?
Well, because the South was very divided around race and around segregation and integration. So the formative experiences of being in a family that was outspoken was powerful. But equally powerful was the experience I had when King assigned me, Dr. King assigned me to organize white mill workers. So what was important about that, that I think is just not generally part of American politics today, is that, I mean, I knew Southern mill workers. They were like my family. I understood them. But by the time he had made that assignment, I had seen them as the enemy.
Right, right.
And there's a parallel in South Africa. The organization Nelson Mandela was with in the 1950s in a campaign called the Congress of the People, which produced the Freedom Charter, the great manifesto against apartheid. They challenged whites to organize in their home communities. And whites in the anti-apartheid movement couldn't do it.
Why?
For over 30 years. Because they saw their home communities as the enemy. They were too alienated, they were too angry. So when King assigned me to do the organizing, it was a very useful challenge. It was me to kind of reconnect with myself as well as do community organizing. So that 7 years I did community organizing in Durham, North Carolina, was very important. And it's a tradition of what I would describe as a different kind of politics, where you learn how to work with people who you may disagree with deeply around a particular issue.
So how'd you do that? So now you how'd you do that? How'd you re-engage with the erstwhile enemy?
Well,
how'd you make things work together?
I did one-on-one interviews and got to know people.
One-on-one.
And hung out on porches and got to, I mean, the very first experience I had in the summer of 1966 was I was working for the poverty program, which didn't have any white dimensions in Durham, North Carolina. And so the Ku Klux Klan came around to the neighborhood and said, no, this guy is a troublemaker. But there was a wonderful woman, Basie Hicks, a textile mill worker, who had never agreed with the Kluxers. She called them the Kluxers. And she went around and said, that guy's a nice kid. He's just up here to
just a kid.
Well, but she took me seriously. He's here to help us organize and see if we can get some voice. That's what she said. So, you know, I immediately met people like Basie. I got to know people are complicated. But I had heard that too. I mean, we tend to remember publicly the civil rights movement as, first of all, focused on great leaders, not on the ground organizing.
Not
and then secondly, as this great moral crusade of the forces of light versus the forces of darkness. But on the ground, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, I would say, unlike the youth wing of the movement, which tended to be more righteous, SCLC had a sense that everyone is complicated. And if you look at King's speeches carefully, you can see
it's all over them.
he's always appealing to the positives in Southern white culture and finding common ground and so
Right.
forth.
And he's not, my takeaway from when I listen to King's words is he rarely is taking much of a swipe at the white. He certainly takes a swipe at hierarchies and sometimes even the white hierarchies. But if you look at the content of his words, they tend to be far more about the human condition, which gets to what you're talking about, this moral. And of course, that is what he's known for. But I have this, it's a bit hard to deal with, but I'm not sure we're always as capable of the moral piece as we are of the human piece. And so why don't we embrace that, which is what you were doing with the whites that you organize. You were embracing the fact that we're all human, we're all complicated. So, if I assume that I'm the moral authority, if I assume that I'm more moral than the other, that's going to make it really hard for me to engage with someone else as a
King
human.
and others like Bayard Rustin and Randolph, there was a very powerful moral dimension to the civil rights movement. It was against the evil of segregation, but they also
But
put
not
the
people,
moral,
the evil of segregation, but not of white people.
No, when they made a distinction between the doer and the deed. That's a useful distinction. But they also believe that movements involve both a moral dimension and a political dimension, and they're not the same thing. So unlike ideological politics, where you tend to demonize the people who you disagree with, politics for SCLC meant something much older in the political tradition. Basically, politics comes from the Greek polis, which means plurality. It means learning how to deal with people who are different. And so they really had that down cold. And again, this was the same dynamic as in South Africa, where I spend several months a year. So last year, Mandela's aide, Jack Kerville, who was the chief of staff during his presidency, said at an interview about Mandela and said that people romanticize Mandela and think of him as a saint. He wasn't a saint. He was political to his toes in the old sense of politics. So Mandela thought, you don't get mad at your enemies. You keep anger disciplined under control. If you get mad at your enemies, you're likely to give them, you're fighting on their terrain. You're generous with your enemies. You learn to be strategic. You learn to see where there's common ground and where there's tension and conflict. It's not a love-in. Politics is never a love-in. But King and others really had that down. So I'd been hearing that.
And in the business vernacular book, that is sort of business 101 for strategic competition, is Sun Tzu's Art of War. And that Sun Tzu's Art of War, he's an ancient philosopher, or military theorist, is basically understand your enemy. If you're going to have an enemy, at least understand them so that you can, might be a little bit of a departure from, I think, what you and I were talking before we started taping, which is it the enemy or is it simply the other who has different beliefs and complicated beliefs? So I want to get a snippet of what that, I want to go back to your point about one-on-ones, because this is a really important aspect of community organizing, and it's at risk, I think, these days when we're so busy and we want to scale and so forth, all of our efforts and movements and businesses and so forth. So what is the importance of one-on-one and what happens in a one? Give me the one-on-one, or the one-on-one 101. How do you like that? And how long do they last? Who do you meet with? How do you know who to meet with? Why do you meet with them?
Well, so one-on-ones can be thought about differently. There are different ways to think about it. It's an intentional practice of what people used to do more spontaneously.
Networking, we call it
in our
business.
society. Well, in the region I come from, it was sitting on the front porch getting to know each other.
That's the best, but we don't all have front porches.
Or in terms of Hubert Humphrey, his father was a druggist in a town of 600 Republicans, and he was one of 6 Democrats. But he made his town, his drugstore, the civic heart of Dolan, South Dakota. So people would discuss politics and public affairs and play music and
And
take action.